Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're turning our attention to an institution that is often called the grandfather of public broadcast.
The BBC.
Exactly, the BBC. It's a cornerstone of the UK's cultural identity, with a history spanning, over a century now.
Right, and yet the stack of sources compiled by our listener paints a picture not of, stability, but of something else entirely.
An existential crisis.
A massive self-inflicted decline, according to...
That's a really strong way to put it.
It is. Our listener has provided us with a highly charged, deeply detailed critique that argues the BBC is hemorrhaging its audience and losing its financial footing.
Okay, but the core argument isn't just about money, is it?
No, not at all. The source claims it's not just failing economically, it's failing culturally. And that's driven by what the source calls a destructive ideological bias and, a resulting collapse in content quality.
Okay, so let's unpack this dense and very controversial material. Our mission today is to function as impartial guide, just distilling the core arguments of this fiery critique.
We have to.
We need to tackle the specific, often technical claims about financial failure, particularly around the contentious license.
Yeah, that's where it all starts.
Then we must dive into the evidence presented for this alleged institutional bias, which the source describes with some extreme rhetoric like hatred of the public.
Which is a very strong claim.
Very strong. And finally, we'll examine how these internal mandates have allegedly dismantled globally successful, beloved UK programming.
We're talking about massive exports like top...
Right, and national favorite like their comedy and drama output. So for you listening, you are joining us as we navigate this stack of complaints and evidence.
It's a compelling narrative because the failure described is circular. Financial stability erodes when the audience...
And the audience leaves when they perceive the content as compromised.
Compromised by ideology, exactly. So we begin necessarily with the money.
Specifically, the mechanism that funds the entire enterprise.
The UK license.
So let's clarify the mechanics of this UK license fee, especially for those listening outside the common.
Yeah, it can be confusing.
This isn't just a voluntary subscription like Netflix.
Not even close. It's effectively a mandatory annual fee. It's currently set at almost £200 a year.
Which is a considerable sum for a lot of households.
Huge sum. And it looks, feels, and is enforced like a tax.
But there's a vital legal nuance here, isn't there? A really important one.
There is a massive, crucial caveat that forms the legal defense for millions of households. Payment is only compulsory if a household watches the BBC or, and this is the key part,
watches any live television broadcast on any channel.
Exactly, regardless of whether that content is even made by the...
So if you strictly use catch-up services, streaming platforms like Netflix or Amazon Prime, or only consume pre-recorded content,
you are perfectly within your legal rights not to pay the license fee.
And that legal foundation is where the entire financial crisis, according to the source, really rests.
It is. It's the crack in the dam.
And this foundation is crumbling, according to these sources. We are presented with figures detailing a really rapid decline.
Yeah, the numbers are pretty stark.
Over a very short recent period, 1 million households have reportedly stopped paying the license fee.
1 million.
And this isn't an anomaly. This is on top of 300,000 who stopped paying the previous year.
So it's accelerating. This cumulative loss signals a major shift in how people consume media.
And the total number of paying households is projected to slide down to around 21 million.
Which the source attributes directly to what they call the competitor factor. I mean, we are no longer living in a media environment where the BBC has a monopoly on quality news or entertainment.
This is where the changing landscape gets really interesting because the source argues that for younger demographics especially, the justification for the license fee has just evaporated.
It's completely gone for them because the alternatives are plentiful, accessible, and often free. When digital platforms like YouTube, TikTok, and these vast streaming libraries offer diverse, hyper-targeted content, the concept of paying nearly £200 a year for a service you might never...
It becomes utterly indefensible.
Exactly. The source notes that younger people, increasingly, have never formed a habit of consuming BBC content. They see the fee as this costly anachronism, especially if they're mostly watching pre-recorded, non-BBC stuff.
So they're simply exercising their legal right.
They are, and this sets the stage for the most highly contentious financial...
Which is how the BBC defines what it's actually...
This brings us to the source's highly critical breakdown of the terminology, specifically around lost revenue.
Okay, let's get into that.
So we have to introduce this staggering figure cited. A Guardian article headline claiming the BBC is losing £1 billion a year in potential license revenue.
£1 billion. On its face, that sounds like a massive financial hole that's suggest the organization is just failing to capture the money.
It sounds catastrophic, but the source's critique is that this figure, while huge, is deeply misleading.
Okay, so how does the BBC arrive at that number, and why does the source reject the term lost revenue?
The source really dissects the calculation. The BBC gets to that figure by combining two very different categories of health.
Okay, what are they?
First, you have those who are actively evading which is illegal because they are watching live television.
Right, the actual rule breakers.
And second, and far more significantly, those households who have legally declared they do not need a TV license because they don't watch live TV or BBC services.
And this second group is perfectly within the law.
Perfectly. And the source's argument is that the BBC includes money it was never legally owed in its loss calculation.
So the source suggests the BBC is acting like it has this institutional entitlement to the money.
Exactly. Viewing it as revenue owed, regardless of whether they provide the service or if the household legally opts out.
That's a very pointed accusation of institutional arrogance.
It is. The source uses this very memorable analogy, comparing it to a corporation like Coca-Cola declaring lost revenue based on every person who didn't buy a Coke today.
That's a great way to put it.
The BBC, having existed for decades on the presumption that every household would pay, allegedly classifies this entirely legal non-payment as a loss simply because they feel entitled.
And that attitude, according to the source, is a massive factor in their inability to adapt.
It is. And that alleged sense of entitlement extends directly into their enforcement tactics.
Right. The sources detail a system that's described as aggressive intimidation, designed purely to frighten people into paying.
The claim is that the BBC uses highly calculated, formal-looking communication designed specifically to scare people that don't know they're right. The letters they send to unlicensed addresses use language crafted to create panic and urgency.
We see examples of this language. Things like, we have passed your details on to the enforcement, or setting an arbitrary 10-day window to comply.
Right. And the source cites instances where letters declared an address still unlicensed, even when the recipient was demonstrably compliant.
Which suggests the system is designed to trigger payment through fear, irrespective of your legal status.
This tactic relies heavily on this historical fear factor, which leads us to the iconic TV detector van myth.
Ah, yes, the detector vans.
For decades, the public has been told that highly sophisticated vans could drive down the street and just know if you were watching TV without a license.
And the source sarcastically highlights these contemporary press releases, mentioning a new generation of detector vans equipped with advanced technology like the ability to remove branding.
The implication, which the source suggests very strongly, is that the threat of the detector van is largely a decades-old psychological tool. Its actual technical effectiveness is often exaggerated or maybe even irrelevant.
But what stands out to me is the hard data the source provides on how effective this aggression actually is.
Go on.
We're told the BBC increased physical visits to unlicensed homes by a massive 50% last. A huge effort. Right.
But that enforcement blitz did not translate into higher sales of licenses or an increase in successful prosecutions.
And that is the critical metric. If you drastically increase the input, the visits, and the output, the sales doesn't budge.
It strongly suggests one of two things.
Either the majority of those homes are legally compliant and are just refusing to be intimidated,
or people are actively rejecting the service by turning off live TV altogether.
Precisely. And the source argues this proves the public is actively rejecting the institution's current offer. It shows a deeper dissatisfaction than just, simple tax evasion.
Okay, so if the financial erosion is the symptom.
The source argues that the cause is ideological. We now transition to the most controversial part of the critique, the claim that the BBC is suffering from a deep, self-imposed ideological crisis.
A crisis that is structurally alienating its audience.
Exactly.
And the rhetoric here is, it's explosive. The core assertion is that the BBC operates as a governmental propaganda wing that actively despises the English public, and that it views its primary mission not as informing,
but as a cultural engineering project to mold, curve, and change public opinion by whatever means necessary.
That is an extreme claim.
It's a huge claim. What evidence does the source provide to back up that explosive assertion about its foundational mission?
The source grounds this assertion in the institutional structures the BBC has created to enforce its world, and the prime example cited is the creation and role of BBC Verify.
Okay, so let's establish what BBC Verify says its role is.
Right. Officially, it's a team of journalists and experts tasked fact-checking, verifying videos, tracking disinformation, and explaining complex. Sounds good on paper.
But the source immediately reaches for highly charged language, comparing this unit to a Ministry of Truth, a reference they explicitly sought out.
They do. The source notes that when they searched for Ministry of, the AI redirected them toward Verify, which the source then details using its own description. Experts in disinformation who will tell you.
So the source views this as the BBC overtly claiming this ultimate state-backed authority over empirical reality.
Yeah, rather than just reporting competing facts.
And this alleged assumption of authority, according to the source, leads directly to editorial failures.
Absolutely. We see specific incidents cited to demonstrate how this ideological lens is warping the reporting. Let's look at the example of car insurance claims.
Okay, this is a fascinating one.
This is a powerful case study for the source's critique. The source calls out reports produced by BBC Verify, suggesting that car insurers were raised.
Because premiums were statistically higher for certain demographic groups.
Right. But this claim, the source argues, demonstrates a fundamental willingness to ignore actuarial reality for the sake of an ideological narrative.
So how does the source counter this claim of bias? Let's explain the actuarial reality they say.
So the source dives into the mechanics of insurance risk calculation. Insurance rates are based purely on risk profiles, the probability and severity of claims.
Variables like age, gender, where you live, your claims history, but not race.
Not race, no. The source provides a key example. Statistics consistently show that younger men have significantly more serious lethal accidents than women of the same.
Right.
Women, on the other hand, might have more small bumps, but are generally more risk-averse drivers.
So if different groups naturally exhibit different driving behaviors and risk profile, men versus women, rural versus urban drivers,
those differences result in different premiums. The source argues this difference is purely actuarial, driven by objective data on claim, not by racial discrimination.
So the critique is that the BBC, when presented with objective data like higher claims in certain areas or age groups,
they ignore the data in favor of a predetermined narrative of systemic injustice.
labeling the industry racist because the outcome isn't perfectly equal across all demographics.
Exactly. And this, to the source, is evidence of the institutional bias in ignoring inconvenient facts to mold public opinion.
And other structural incidents are also cited, suggesting the problems are systemic, not just isolated.
Right. The source mentions a devastating memo that exposed internal bias, with allegations of a doctored speech from the U.S.
and reports of rogue units censoring coverage of certain sensitive news reports,
pointing to editorial control being exercised to favor specific political or social outcomes.
And then there is the peculiar Martin Croxall incident.
Yes.
Which focuses not on content, but on the policing of emotional neutrality. A newsreader allegedly broke internal rules simply for exhibiting a facial expression,
while reading a news item about aged pregnant people, women, and those with.
And the source details the reaction, describing it as just opening her eyes a bit, maybe in slight surprise or confusion.
Right, and points out the irony.
The BBC was so focused on enforcing this strict standard of unapproved reaction, making a facial muscle twitch a potential disciplinary issue,
that they missed the bigger picture, the language of the report itself.
which the source suggests was excessively convoluted or politically charged. That was the real issue.
But the focus was on compliance to a narrative, not journalistic stuff. And this leads directly into the source's fundamental critique about staff.
The homogeneity.
Exact. The source asserts that the BBC draws its staff from an ever-widening pool of liberal, left, middle-class humanities graduates.
And the consequence of this highly uniform pipeline is allegedly a massive worldview problem.
A huge one. These staff members, having been educated and hired within a bubble, view their own political opinions not as perspective,
but as accepted fact.
They believe they are, in the source's words, marching forwards ever closer to utopia.
The critical and dangerous implication being that anyone who disagrees with this consensus,
anyone who is skeptical of the path forward,
is automatically categorized as evil or backward or just standing in the way of progress.
And this creates what the source calls a permanent blind spot that infects all content.
Because if staff can't intellectually entertain the possibility that an opposing viewpoint might have merit or that dissenting data might be true,
they are unwilling or unable to simulate or model any opposing point of view.
Which is devastating to quality.
It is. It hinders genuine change because the staff fundamentally cannot understand or relate large segments of the public they are meant.
If they don't understand why someone might be skeptical of the license,
or why they might want to watch three middle-aged men talking about cars,
they can only conclude that the public is simply wrong and needs to be educated or molded.
Right. And the source reinforces this structural analysis with external data.
From the YouGov poll.
Yeah, the data. 31% of the public believes BBC News is biased in favor of left.
Compare that to just 19% who see it as right-wing bias and 19% who view it as strictly neutral.
So public perception strongly aligns with the source's internal critique of this ideological.
And this creates a vicious cycle.
It does. Those hired by this homogenous system become true believers whose careers now depend entirely on continuing the ideology.
Not on quality or public satisfaction.
No. The source posits that if the BBC were ever forced to pivot back to quality and giving the public what they wanted, these staffers would worry about being redundant or fired.
So their duty becomes changing the public to fit the BBC's mold, rather than adapting the BBC to serve the public.
So we've established the financial pressure and this ideological engine driving the...
Now we turn to the most tangible evidence of the source's claim, the alleged destruction of high-quality, globally recognized BBC content.
The ideological demands, the source claims, are what drove out key talent and dismantled profitable programs.
And the prime case study for this institutional failure is top.
It has. We must first put its success perspective. This was not just a popular show.
No, it was a global phenomenon.
The source notes that in 2010, the show was watched by 350 million viewers across 170 countries.
It was a massive global export, one of the most successful TV shows of all time, generating hundreds of millions in revenue.
So if the numbers were stellar, what was the core conflict?
The source claims that BBC senior management appeared to harbor a deep resentment toward the established lineup, Jeremy Clarkson, Richard Hammond, and James May.
And why?
Precisely because the presenters were so popular, while simultaneously being what the source describes as simply English in England.
They were successful for reasons the executives did not approve of.
That's the argument. And this institutional disdain is perfectly captured by a specific anecdote about a meeting Clarkson was called.
Okay.
The bosses were celebrating the show's tremendous diversity success, noting that Top Gear was successfully pulling in Black and Asian viewers organically, purely based on the quality of the content.
So a success story.
You would think. And what was their immediate jarring response to this organic success?
Instead of celebrating the existing dynamic,
The suggested replacing one of the hosts with a young Black or Asian presenter.
the source frames this as profoundly patronizing and counterproductive.
I can see why. The audience had already voted with their remote controls to watch the chemistry of three particular white middle-aged men.
Right. But the executive mandate was not based on serving the audience's preference.
It was about breaking up the winning team to enforce a demographic quota.
And the source insists the success was never really about cars.
It was about the adventures of three clever middle-aged blokes whose chemistry was irreplaceable.
And the source argues this tension made the fallout inevitable.
Clarkson was fired in 2015 following the now famous punching incident.
An event the source frames as a convenient excuse for management that already wanted him gone.
And this decision came after the BBC bought the full rights to the show in 2012.
So they paid a huge sum to control a property. They then allegedly neutered by removing its central, irreplaceable talent.
This is where the ideological critique connects directly to the business failure.
The source's contention is that Clarkson represented a hierarchical view of talent. He was demonstrably better, more central, and thus more valuable than the others.
And he had the dangly bits the executive culture allegedly despised.
The organization, in this view, cannot tolerate the idea of innate differences or hierarchies of talent, or the fact that some people are just exceptional at specific jobs.
So they treated him as an interchangeable cog in the machine.
Which resulted in the immediate death of the franchise's global profitability.
And this alleged pattern of prioritizing an ideological mandate over objective talent also permeates the realm of comedy and panel shows.
Yes. The key turning point cited is the policy change implemented in 2014 that explicitly banned the commissioning of new all-male panels.
The source argues this was a sledgehammer approach that structurally degraded comedy quality overnight.
Because historically, panel shows often drew from the stand-up circuit, which, for various cultural reasons was often...
And the few women who succeeded, like Jo Brand or Sarah Millican, were, by necessity, incredibly talented.
They had to compete fiercely to reach...
So by mandating immediate gender balance via a ban, the source argues the BBC created too many open spots for too few female comedians that were any good in the short term.
The requirement shifted the focus from absolute comedic merit to identity compliance.
Leading, in the source's view, to a noticeable drop in overall joke quality.
And we see specific examples of this institutional shift in beloved franchises. Consider QI.
Okay.
The source points out that Stephen Fry, the iconic host, was replaced by Sandy Talk.
And while acknowledging Toksvig is a funny and successful comedian.
The source claims the decision was rooted not in finding the best replacement, but in addressing statistics.
Only 4 episodes over 32 in the recent history had featured more than one female contributor.
So the source argues the primary motivator was what was between her legs, reflecting a policy decision rather than a talent.
And the compliance struggle was evident elsewhere.
Right. The source points to data from 2 other major panel shows, Mock the Week and Have I Got News for You?
And despite the 2014 directive.
Mock the Week, which typically featured 7 contributors weekly, had not had more than 1 woman in an episode since the policy.
That's surprising.
And similarly, Have I Got News for You had run 3 full seasons, 29 episodes, with only 2 of those featuring more than 1 woman as a contributor.
So what does the source interpret from that?
The source interprets this data as a quiet admission. Even when under a corporate directive to diversify, the producers of these shows were likely prioritizing high-standard comedic talent.
Even if it meant quietly defaulting back to a less compliant lineup to maintain quality.
That's the argument. And the critique extends further, reaching into educational content and historical adaptations.
Well, the source labels historical revisionism, particularly within BBC Teach.
Yeah, the sources cite specific critiques of educational cartoons aimed at children, which the source views as ideological messaging disguised as history.
The Boudica and the Roman invasion cartoon is called out.
On 2 grounds. First, it portrays ancient English people as needing sun protection.
Which the source points out is ludicrous given the historical reality of, cloudy, rainy UK weather.
And second, the cartoon allegedly made the strange claim that the Romans weren't actually Italian.
The source argues that while the Roman Empire encompassed many ethnicities, this specific choice is anachronistic, designed to dilute the specific cultural and historical identity of the invasion narrative.
And this links to the broader ideological goal of altering established lore when adapting work. The source spends considerable time on the discussion surrounding J.R.R.
The critique here is directed at media discourse that justifies adapting Tolkien's work by questioning if the author himself was really racist.
The source argues this is a cynical strategy. Attack the author's character to grant the adapter moral license, destroy the history.
So the goal, according to this analysis, is not fidelity, but reconstruction.
They're changing the material to reflect how it would be better.
Meaning making Middle-earth less hierarchical, less specific in its cultural origin, and more of a vibrant melting pot.
Even if it contradicts the original lore and cultural specificity that made the work resonate.
And we see a final peculiar example of this with the ongoing Doctor Who revival.
Right. We have to acknowledge the immense success of the Russell T Davies revival initiative. It brought the series back to cultural prominence.
However, the source claims the series subsequently declined due to increasing ideology.
Citing the perceived inability to sustain a male-presenting Time Lord as evidence of an ideological mandate overriding creative freedom.
And the critique lands on an upcoming Doctor Who spin-off, The War Between Land and Sea.
The source notes a specific visual change. One of the female sea devils, a classic monster, was made remarkably human.
And the source speculates this design choice was made for ideological reasons, maybe to enable a more complex or potentially romantic interspecies relationship,
rather than presenting them as strictly alien adversaries. But the irony, according to the source, is found in the plot itself.
The narrative is noted as awkwardly portraying humans as the good guys defending their territory against an invasive species that is trying to kill them.
The source finds this jarring because, given the BBC's alleged bias towards specific modern social narrative, a story about indigenous populations defending their land against invaders.
It seems to run counter to the kind of messaging they usually enforce.
Yes. The BBC, in the source's view, accidentally created a plot that undermines its own dominant ideological lens.
So across all these content areas, global blockbusters, national comedy, historical properties, the source's narrative is consistent.
Ideological compliance is prioritized, leading to the destruction of original talent and quality, thereby eliminating the only remaining justification for the license.
Okay, so given this trifecta of financial erosion, institutional bias, and content deterioration, the inevitable question is, what's the plan for survival?
According to the source, the BBC's response has been one of structural denial.
The source asserts that the BBC has made 0 meaningful attempts to adapt its content model or address the audience's growing rejection.
Instead, its focus has been on gaslighting the public, making them believe they're wrong to disagree.
And trying to strong-arm the government into changing taxation laws to force payment.
This is the financial Hail Mary path, designed to mandate survival rather than earn.
We need to detail the funding alternatives the BBC has reportedly considered, all of which the source views as deeply cynical.
The most contentious option is adding a tax onto broadband connects.
A broadband tax. So that would ensure that virtually every household, Even those who don't own a TV would be forced to pay for the BBC.
It's designed to eliminate the one legal loophole people currently use to opt out.
And the other options floated.
Funding the BBC entirely through general tax. The source calls this stealing from people via a general tax.
Or moving toward a hybrid model of part funding through advertising or a pure subscription.
The source states a clear preference for the latter, predicting that if the BBC were forced to survive purely on voluntary subscriptions, it would definitely kill the organization as an industry giant.
Interestingly, the political environment has shown some resistance to these ideas.
It has. We must note that the Culture Secretary has officially ruled out funding the BBC from general tax.
But the source is deeply cynical about political assurance, expressing profound distrust in any statement made by politicians.
The source believes the BBC will just keep lobbying until they get their preferred funding, regardless of any temporary political.
So if we connect this failure to adapt back to the bigger picture of media consumption,
the source argues that the BBC, along with traditional media outlets like The Guardian, has utterly lost its power to act as the primary gatekeeper.
the organization that tells you.
That power is gone, and that is the pivotal shift in public trust, accelerated by technology.
The rise of instantaneous, unfiltered information access has encouraged the public to believe they have first-hand access to the real fact.
They no longer need all information filtered through the BBC or The Guardian, which they perceive as inherently biased.
The source argues that when the public realized they could access raw information, they also realized how often the traditional press had previously filtered or distorted it.
But this informational void isn't static. It's being filled by new gatekeepers.
Which the source uses to draw a stark contrast with the BBC's mandatory model.
They point to platforms like Twit, where a single person can be watched for 10 hours a day and effectively become a viewer's personalized news station,
filtering everything through their specific, known personal lens.
The irony is profound. The public is replacing one singular filter, the mandatory, state-sponsored BBC, with highly personalized, optional, and often free filters.
And while these new gatekeepers are also biased, the key difference is choice.
That's it. The source emphasizes that these independent content creators are perfectly entitled to run a business and be biased if people voluntarily give them money for it.
Whereas the BBC mandates payment via a tax and sends intimidating letters in return for what the source deems propaganda.
So if we connect this to the biggest picture, the source argues the BBC's core problem is cultural, not financial.
It's a deep institutional inability to understand or tolerate viewpoints outside of its homogeneous, self-affirming ideology.
Which is why their survival strategy is focused entirely on enforced compliance and mandate rather than fundamental reform of content and approach.
They can't change because the internal structure views disagreement as morally evil. So what does this highly charged critique mean for you, the knowledge seeker? We've explored the claims that the decline of a massive institution is intrinsically linked to the public's access to unfiltered information.
While simultaneously witnessing the rise of new gatekeepers, you are exchanging one type of filter for another, but the choice has become voluntary.
Which makes the mandatory model of the BBC harder and harder to justify in the digital.
This raises an important question. If the BBC's internal structure creates a permanent blind spot, preventing it from attracting diverse talent or changing direction because employees equate opposing views with moral failure.
How long can any large taxpayer-funded institution survive when it fundamentally misunderstands and actively attempts to mold the people it is designed to serve?
They are so busy trying to dictate reality that they haven't noticed reality has moved on without.
The source claims that the genuinely talented people who made the BBC's classic, globally successful shows couldn't make it in today's arena.
Because those in charge would never allow them to be successful if they didn't align perfectly with the current ideological mandate.
So is the true measure of institutional failure not the £1 billion in contentious lost revenue, but the sheer inability to recognize, hire, or tolerate genuine talent if it doesn't align perfectly with the prevailing institutional ideology?
That is the ultimate cost of a self-imposed blind spot.